I'm going to begin this whole program. One of my favorite poets is Rumi, and I think, how many Rumi fans in here? What an amazing man, beautiful man. Rumi makes this statement. He says, what strange beings we are. I could have stopped right there and agreed with everything. I know that's true. But he goes on to say that sitting in hell at the bottom of the dark, we're afraid of our own immortality. Isn't a powerful thing to say? In addition to maybe being afraid of our own immortality, my sense from traveling the world over the last 20 years is what really frightens us the most is that we know we have the ability to heal the hell that we find ourselves in. And I think knowing that we have that power within us scares us in ways maybe that we're only beginning to understand. I asked yesterday, I'm going to ask again, how many believe there's a power within you that's untapped? You have not used your fullest potential. I believe that as well. And my question is, why aren't we using it? If we were ever going to bring that power to bear on the world, doesn't today seem like a really good time to do it? You look at what's happening in the world. I've had some feedback from some members of the religious community about some of the material that I've been sharing over the last 20 years, because much of what I'm sharing now was part of our literature in our pre-biblical and early biblical texts, and it was edited right out in the 4th century, in the year 324, 325 AD, 1700 years ago, because at that time the church believed that we were not capable of dealing with the power that those words elicited from our hearts. And what those people are saying to me today, they're saying, Greg, there's a reason why this information was edited out 1700 years ago. What gives you the right to share it today? And my feeling is if we're ever going to do the things that we know we can do, what better time than today? Because for the first time in all of recorded human history, we have at our fingertips the power to destroy everything that we cherish as a civilization. And we also have the power to preserve all that we love and cherish and hold dear. Western science now acknowledges this field is here. It's no longer hypothetical. It's not airy-fairy. It's not New Age wishful thinking. Although the spiritual and the indigenous traditions have told us that we're united for over 5,000 years, Western science is now on board. Western science has now arrived at the place where those ancient traditions have always begun, with the fact that we are united through this field of energy. Number two, the discoveries show that the stuff we're made of, the stuff of our world, literally is a materialization in visible form of the invisible stuff that is in this field of the divine matrix. In other words, this field contains the blueprint for all possibilities. They are a potential. For you engineers out there, they are scalar. And it is the power of emotion and belief that translates that potential into something real in our world and real in our lives. For you engineers, something vector. So we're talking about scalar and vector potential, or what is invisible and what is visible. The question is, now that we know these things exist, how much power do we really have in our lives? How much power do we have to change our lives, or to change our bodies, or to change our world within the context of everything that we're now knowing to be true? So these new discoveries suggest that this power to change is based in our belief of what is real within this divine matrix. It's based in what we believe to be true, because our beliefs are what's translating these possibilities into the reality of the world. Remember back in the old days when you were in school probably, and when I was in school, and we were taking physics, and physics and the atoms were about things called protons, electrons, neutrons. Remember? We thought it was a big deal and complex then. It's simple compared to where we are now. We had the mechanical view of the atom that looks something like this, like a little solar system. We now know that our world doesn't work that way, that what we call our reality looks like this. There's nothing there. It's all potential. It is a potential of waves, and this is an actual film footage of what an atom, the way an atom works today. What we know about the way the atom works today, it is a pattern of energy that is vibrating. When it vibrates really slow, it gets real dense. When it vibrates fast, it gets very ethereal. Our world, our bodies, are made of this stuff, regulated by our beliefs and by our consciousness. So now we've got to ask ourselves, how real is reality? I mean, how real is this reality? It sounds kind of like there was a woman in the bookstore, and the beautiful woman working behind the counter is absolutely mystified about what we're doing here this weekend. So we went down. I went down to get my water, and she said, "What's this program all about?" And a couple of sentences I summarized. She goes, "Well, it sounds like philosophy to me." And I said, "Well, in a sense, it is. It's the philosophy of what's real in our world, what's real in our life. How real is reality?" We've been exploring this for the last 5,000 years, and even recently, in the 20th century, we've had programs helping us to explore these. Any Outer Limits fans or Twilight Zone fans here? There was an episode, and I wrote about this in the book, so that's why I'm sharing it with you. One of the most powerful episodes that I saw when I was probably, 10, 11 years old when this first episode, it was when the old black and white episodes came out. See if you remember this one. World War II, there's a couple of fighter pilots. They're in a plane, and the plane has been hit. And the way this particular plane works, it's got a glass canopy underneath where a man sits all by himself. He's got a 360-degree view, and he can tell the pilot when enemy fighters are coming up. This plane is hit, and they're going to have to land. And as the pilot makes the I'm going to shorten and condense this tremendously. As the pilot makes the arrangements and everything he does to have to land, what they realize is they're on their way to their final approach is that there's no landing gear left on the plane. And he's got a choice. He is either going to land and save the crew, but he's going to kill his friend who's in that glass canopy underneath. Or they're going to try to ditch it in the ocean and maybe lose everybody. You remember that episode? Anybody see it? It's a powerful episode. And what happens? What happens is it's the reason I'm sharing this story, is because he has to make this decision. And you see most of the program is the pilot's turmoil. He's wrenching inside, knowing he's about to kill his friend. And he says, "I've got to do this. This is what I have to do." He takes the plane in for a landing. And all of a sudden, something happens. And this is what the whole story is all about. The camera zooms in. The man on the canopy knows the same thing. He knows his friend, the pilot, has to make this choice. And there's not much he can do. And he reaches into his backpack and pulls out a sketch pad. And I thought, now that's interesting. And he sketches a picture of the plane. And underneath the plane, he sketches some landing gear and some tires. And these aren't plain old tires. These look like big Donald Duck cartoon tires, like big round puffy donuts that are glimmering and shimmering on my old black and white TV. I lived in the world of black and white up until 1995 anyway, so I'm a low-tech guy in a high-tech world. All of a sudden, the pilot lands this plane. He's on the runway. He's expecting this to come to a skidding stop, and he realizes that he's got landing gear, and he can't figure out why. The plane stops, they all jump out, and they turn around and look, and they see their friend getting out of this canopy underneath. And he's in a daze, and he's got his sketch pad. And as he walks towards his friends, that plane is sitting there, and these big, fat, donut-like tires are sitting there holding it up. And as they hug each other and look back to the plane, the man that did the drawing awakens from his trance. Those tires disappear, the plane drops onto the tarmac and bursts into flames. And they just cry in disbelief. What a powerful story. Powerful, powerful story. Now that was a make-believe story, but it's important. It's important. It's a fictional story because it reminds us that the very experience of belief that you and I have been conditioned to discount since we were children is precisely the power that the ancient indigenous people told us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the single most powerful force in the world, in the universe. And now Western physics is beginning to find the same thing. You're going to see this. We're going to see the experiments that show how and the quality of what we believe determines what's happening in our world. It determines that. That was a fictional story, but we have all heard about stories that are not so fictional. There was a story a couple of years ago. A woman in the Midwest, upper Midwest, was walking down the street. All of a sudden, she saw a car slip out of gear on a hill from beside a road, rolled down a hill, and struck a young boy who was standing at a street corner waiting for a bus, and the car stopped. And this woman walked over to that car, and she picked up the back end of the car and held it up so this boy would live until rescuers could get underneath, pull the boy out. He was unconscious. Then she got into the ambulance and rode with him to the hospital and was in the emergency waiting room. And the doctor came out and said, this boy's going to be just fine thanks to you picking that car up so he could get out from underneath it. She was in an altered state. She was in a trance. When she heard the doctor tell her what she had done, she passed out and collapsed because it was more than her belief system could sustain. The fact that it happened means that it's possible. What is it within us? What is within us that allows us to perform these miraculous feats beyond our potential? And why does it only happen at those special times? Why don't we do it all the time? The question that we're asking is, who are we? Who are we? These mysterious beings that Rumi talks about. These strange, powerful, mystical, mysterious beings. Are we truly passive observers in the universe? Are we just passing through a moment in time late in the development of this universe with very little effect on the world around us? Or, as many physicists are beginning to say, and as our ancient and indigenous predecessors told us, are we powerful creators actually creating this universe as we go? We talked about this yesterday. I won't go into it a lot, but I'm going to say there are physicists today, particularly Dr. John Wheeler of Princeton University, who is literally saying that the universe exists because of consciousness. Maybe not yours and mine today, but because of consciousness in general. And that our consciousness today is continuing to add to and change and evolve the universe. And this is precisely what our most cherished traditions have said to us, that we're part of everything that we see. We have direct access to the most fundamental creative forces in this universe that gives us the power to heal our bodies, to heal the bodies of our loved ones, to bring peace to our world, abundance into our lives, because that is our ability to do precisely these things. It's all about quantum energy, the stuff that we're made of. We now know that quantum energy is directly affected by belief. Belief! What physicists now know is that quantum energy is directly affected by the power of belief. Belief is literally a code. You all are programmers. You all are programmers. You're physicists. You have to be to live in this world. You also have to be a little nutty to live in this world. You think so? I was just having this conversation with a woman on the plane on the way out here, because an absolutely sane, rational person probably could not sustain the hurt of all the things that are happening in this world today. We're going to talk about the power of hurt in just a few minutes. So we're all a little out there. We have to be just to get by, but we can have fun with it. Belief is a code. Belief is what translates the invisible potential. What physicists are saying is that the blueprint for everything you could ever imagine already exists. All of the peace, all of the healing, all of the abundance, all of the joy, as well as the darkness and the Holocaust and the war and the death and the suffering and destruction, they all exist as potential in this quantum field. And it's where we place our focus that locks one of those possibilities into place and brings it into this material world. You're going to see exactly how it happens. The code that translates the invisible energy into what we see as the visible matter. A growing number of scientists, mainstream scientists, are now saying that our universe and our reality works like a giant, massive consciousness computer. I was a senior computer systems designer at Martin Marietta Aerospace, and when I saw this, I said, cool. Tell me more. Most of us are familiar enough with computers now that we can use this as an analogy, and I've found that it helps. We did this in Germany and Australia. Well, Australia was English audience, pretty much, except for all those Australian words that I haven't figured out yet. But everybody seemed to relate to this model, so I chose to use it here today. A computer, any computer, no matter how small or how big, pretty much operates the same way. All computers have what are called hardware. It's your keyboards. It's your screen. It's where the output from your computer is seen on a printer or a plotter of some kind. We have what is called an operating system. Sometimes it's a Macintosh or a Windows XP or a Unix or a Sun operating system. And we have programs. The programs speak to the hardware through the operating system. The operating system is the intermediary that allows our programs, Word, Microsoft Works, Mac picture, whatever it is, to talk to the hardware. You're okay with that, right? Makes sense? Okay, if you're okay with that, let's compare our electronic computer to our consciousness computer. An electronic computer has hardware or the output. Our consciousness computer of the universe has hardware or output that we call the physical world. An electronic computer, as we just said, has an operating system. Consciousness has an operating system that is called consciousness. An electronic computer has programs that speak through the operating system to change the output. Our consciousness computer also has programs that speak through the consciousness to change our physical world. What do we call those programs? Precisely, we call it feeling and belief. What we believe and how we feel about what we believe. Does this make sense to you? Okay with this so far? Okay, are you sure? Because if it does, and this analogy works for you, then I'm going to share something with you that may be a little different from what we've heard in the past. How many people have heard it say we've got to change our consciousness? You hear that all the time. I had a phone call a few weeks ago. They said, Greg, you have to come to this little town outside of Chicago because the forces of darkness are taking over and doing all these programs. We need you to come do a program of light to change the consciousness. Okay, I understand it's well-intentioned. I know what it means. But look at what's happening here. If you want to change what's happening, for all intents and purposes, on your program, if you want to change what comes out of your computer, do you change your operating system? Do you change Windows XP? Do you go get something else? Or Windows 98 or Mac version 7? Or where's Mac right now? Version 8? Version 9? I don't even know. 10? That's why my Mac doesn't work anymore. I haven't updated it since version 7. It's still there. What is it? It's version what? 10.3. 10.3. Wow. Cool. So for all intents and purposes, the operating system is fixed. It doesn't change. What changes is the programs that go into the operating system that are communicating. Well, if we're using this analogy and this metaphor, if we want to change our world, if we want to heal our bodies, bring peace to our world, abundance in our lives, nurturing, compassionate relationships, it's not about changing the consciousness because our consciousness is essentially fixed. It's about changing what goes into the consciousness. If we want to change in the output on the computer, we're changing the programs. If we want to change our physical world, we've got to change our beliefs and our feelings. Does that make sense? Are you okay with that? The way to do that was the subject of ancient traditions. Entire libraries, temple walls, and texts were left to us for over 8,000 years telling us precisely how we do just this. And over time, bits and pieces of that have been lost in the language of spirituality. Edits were made, translations were made. You're going to see a translation here that might surprise you before the end of our hour. Western physics, modern science, is only about 400 years old, however, and they are rediscovering in a language that they are comfortable with precisely the same principles. Reality is a code. It is literally a code. The title of this program is Rewriting the Reality Code because that is precisely what you and I are doing individually and collectively. A code that is based on belief. How many of you are familiar with the cold fusion experiments back in the 1980s? Remember hearing about cold fusion? It was a big deal all over the news. It was the answer to our energy problems of the 70s that we had. It put out more energy than it took to create that energy, and all of a sudden we didn't hear about it anymore. What happened? How come? Where's cold fusion today? Well, here's what happened. What the scientists found was they could use the same equipment in the same laboratory, and sometimes that equipment would create cold fusion, and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes the experiments were successful, sometimes they were not, and they couldn't figure out why. And it took a particularly astute young physicist at the University of Colorado in Boulder, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon over a chicken salad sandwich, I would imagine. And he said, you guys, I don't know if this is important or not, but I've noticed a pattern. He said, why is it more often than not, when the scientists in the room believe in cold fusion, the experiments are successful? And when they are skeptical, the experiments fail. And this led to a whole series of studies that are still going on today. The bottom line, they discovered that the expectation of the people in the room was influencing the outcome of the experiment. Well, you can't have a global energy system based on something that people believe in. I've thought about this. I wouldn't want to be flying in a plane with a pilot who was questioning whether or not the cold fusion flying his plane was making it work or not. This is how we're going about finding out this power of belief in our lives. There are sects of Buddhism that literally say the reality of our world exists only where our mind creates a focus. Only where our mind creates a focus. There was an experiment launched in 1909 that began the whole field of quantum physics, and we're still talking about this today. How many of you on your bedstand for light bedtime reading have an illustrious copy of the world-famous double-slit experiment? Don't you all read that before you go to bed at night? Well, in case you haven't, we're going to reenact it here. This is a very bizarre experiment. Again, physicists are still talking about it. Some are familiar with it, some are not. What they did in 1909 was they took a particle, a quantum particle, the stuff our world is made of, a photon or an electron, and they shot that particle into a target that could determine whether or not the particle was still a particle when it got there, or if something else happened. And the only catch to this experiment was that the particle had to go through a barrier that had an opening. Well, this part of the experiment was done early in the morning, and it was an easy part of the experiment. Let's just do it right now. Let's shoot this particle. We're going to go through this opening. It's going to hit that target, and let's see what happens. Boom, here it goes. The particle begins as a particle. It goes through that opening. It ends as a particle. Right now, the particle is acting just like a particle, and everybody's really happy and very comfortable with all of their theories and their formulas. Okay, sometime after lunch, they did this experiment again. Here's what happened. Everything is the same. They're using the same kind of particle, the same kind of a target. This time, however, the barrier has two openings. Now, this is a physical particle, this quantum particle. So the thinking is it's got to either go through this opening or this opening, right? Something mysterious happens, and that mystery is the mystery that is still being talked about in quantum physics today. Here's what happens. The particle leaves it a particle and it disappears. That's your contemplation question mark. You're supposed to go, where did that particle go? Okay, but what happened next is mind-boggling, because somehow the particle knew, if a particle can know, that two openings were available. And rather than staying as a particle and going through one or another, it accommodated both openings. It showed up twice at the target, but it's not a particle. It's a wave. It has transformed itself from a particle to a wave so that it accommodates both of those openings. The particle begins as a particle, as matter. It ends up as a wave, as energy. It begins as a visible form of matter. It ends up as an invisible form of energy. And this is where the scientists started to have a bad day. Because it messed up everything. It messed up everything. And the question that they asked is why? Why did this happen? What is it that caused this to happen? The question is, and here's a little clue. I knew it'd be early in the morning. I'd put a clue up here. Who knows that those two openings are possible? Who knows that that particle has a choice in terms of where it goes? And here's your clue, and it'll stay up here all day long until we know who it is. Okay, the particle knows, and the scientists in the room, and they said, my God, does the fact that we know those particles exist influence what's happening with the experiment? And the answer is yes. And this is what is so bizarre about where quantum physics is today. The observer knows. But what physicists are now beginning to understand is there's no such thing as an observer. It's impossible for you and I to sit and observe the world. If you're looking at something and your attention and your awareness are focused on that something, you are creating, whether you're aware of your creation or not, you are creating something. It's the quality of your attention and your awareness while you are focused. This is a direct quote from John Wheeler, a contemporary of Albert Einstein's. He's still with us today. And listen to what he says about this experiment. He says, quote, "We had this old idea that there's a universe out there, and here is man, the observer, safely protected from the universe by what he calls a 6-inch slab of plate glass." Says so that we can't touch that universe. However, he says, now we learn that to even observe an electron, we have to shatter that plate glass, so the old word observer has to be crossed off the books. There is no observer. He said we must put in the new word participator. And I love that word, participator. It means that the act of us conscious and aware, looking at the world around us, is an act of creation unto itself. It's not about control. It's not about manipulation. This is the beautiful word, participator. You and I are participating in the outcome of our world. Well, that experiment that was done in 1909 was performed again in 1998. And this time they had better equipment. And they could do the measurements even better. And what they found is so beautiful. So beautiful. I wanted you to see this. This was done in 1998. Researchers at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, they conducted a highly controlled experiment demonstrating, again, how electrons are affected by the act of being observed. So they validated what they found in 1909. However, they found something new. Look at the next piece of this. Look at what they say. It's so important, I wrote it right there. Important. Because I know we got note takers in here. Important. What they found is not only does the observation affect what the electron is doing, they said the experiment, quote, the experiment revealed that the greater the amount of watching, the greater the observer's influence on what takes place. Which is what our spiritual traditions have always said to us in their purest form. It's where we place our focus and our intent, our heart-based focus and intent, as we discovered yesterday, that is having the effect on the world around us. And it can have all kinds of effects. This is the stuff that made Einstein crazy. Einstein didn't like this. He didn't like thinking that we live in a world where somehow we're influencing what's happening. I wanted to put this quote in here. He said, quote, "I like to think that a particle must have a separate reality independent of the measurements." In other words, he said, "I like to think the moon is there even if I'm not looking at it." Then a beautiful quote from Einstein. What an amazing man. So, if we are participating, if we are the participants, how does that participation work? How does it come about? Well, it's where we place our focus, where we place our attention. And what I'd like to do, I want to talk to you about a couple of the different theories of reality that are floating around right now. No one knows for certain. I'm going to be very clear. Scientists create hypotheses. And they work with them until they find a place where it doesn't work anymore, and then they modify them and create a new hypothesis. Over the last 70 or 80 years, what I'm about to share with you is the consensus. This is pretty much where mathematicians, physicists, and other disciplines of scientists have come to agree that all the formulas work and the theories seem to fit this idea. What they're saying is this, and it's supposed to be transparent to you, the audience, but I carefully orchestrated and planted the seed about 45 minutes ago for what we're going to do right now. Because what they say is this. They say that we live in this quantum flux of possibilities. That there's this field out there called the divine matrix. And it's in here. We're part of it. It's a living, pulsating, glimmering, shimmering. You like those words? Essence of stuff. It is like a projector screen that is everywhere. Instead of being in front of us, it's everywhere all the time. And we are like the projectors, except we're not only the projector, we're what is projected. It's like we're artists. We're not only the artist, we're the canvas that we place the art upon. We're the brushes that put the pigment on the canvas. We are the experiencers as well as the creators of the experience. What a bizarre concept. Really bizarre concept. And what they say is in this quantum flux, everything that you could ever imagine exists as a possibility. This is so important, I'm saying it twice. And they say what we do, there are many possibilities. There's possibility A, where you married your high school sweetheart. That's a possibility. There's possibility B, where you didn't marry your high school sweetheart. There's a possibility C, where you married your high school sweetheart but didn't last. There's a possibility D, where you never married your high school sweetheart, but you met at your high school reunion 40 years later and had a fling. Okay, I don't know where that came from. Actually, I know where it came. I've got a reunion coming up. That's where it came from. But it hasn't happened yet. They say all these possibilities exist as potential. And what we do is we lock into one of those potentials. This is the power of imagination. This is the power of thought. Thought in and of itself has very little power. Thought in and of itself simply is a possibility. So we think about the things in our lives, about our healing and about peace, or about the disease that the Fair and Balanced 6 o'clock news tells us we're all going to get with the flu epidemic that comes around in a couple of months. Okay, we think about those things. They have very little power until we breathe and imbue those thoughts with the power of our emotion, our dislike for what we see, or our love for what we are seeing in our mind. And that is how we lock one of these possibilities into place. It then moves from the wave potential, the invisible scalar possibility, into the particle, vector, reality of our real world. You and I are creators, and this is how we do it. We're programming this consciousness computer. Does that make sense? Does that metaphor work for you? I put this program together. This is probably the only time this program will ever be used, this 90-minute program. I did this just for you, and so I'm asking because I've never used this metaphor in this way before. So, we lock that possibility into place. Now, there are different theories about how these possibilities work. They all are in general agreement that there are multiple possibilities and that our attention locks one of them into place and anchors it as a reality in our world. Does that make sense? You okay with that? How do you feel about that possibility? So the question is, the greater the amount of watching, the greater our influence on what's going on. Where is our attention and focus in the world today? What are we being, in the West, what are we being conditioned to focus on? If where we place our attention and our focus is taking these invisible quantum possibilities and locking them into place as what's real, and our world around us is any indication of what that is, where are we being asked to place our attention today? Where are we placing our focus today? Look at what's happening. We are bombarded in the news with all kinds of information about all the bad things happening in our world. We're being told how scary the rest of the world is. We're being told about all the frightening disasters that are happening in the world. And we're being told right now, if we don't watch out, we're going to end up with a big mushroom cloud on the horizon somewhere. If these theories that now are being proven in Western physics work out the way it looks like they're working out, and our physical reality is based on where we place our attention and focus and our beliefs of those things, look at what's happening. The good news is the reverse happens and it can change in a heartbeat. We're looking at two very radical possibilities on the horizon right now. Either one of the worst, darkest times in human history, or we're all going to figure this out and heal and have one of the most beautiful 1,000 years of human history. The question is, what's it going to be? And I think we all know what we're choosing. It's all based on how you feel. The key is, it's not enough to say that you believe in these things unless you embody that belief. If you simply say it and you don't embody it, you set yourself up for some really, really frightening experiences. I know people that have done this. I know people that had cancers and were so frightened, they were paralyzed by their cancer with fear. And they said, I'm going to beat this thing. I'm going to go the holistic route. Those were the words. They were so frightened that they couldn't really believe and trust their body because their cancer led them to believe that their body failed them. So they did only the holistic route, and they got worse and worse, and they're no longer here today because it's not enough to say that you believe these things. You've got to embody them. And I want to talk a little bit about how we go about doing these things. If belief translates this invisible energy of what we feel into visible matter, then the question is, why do we die? I asked this question in the book, The Isaiah Effect, before our time. Why is it that we die? What we know right now. What is the leading cause of adults over 65 years of old? Anybody? Exactly. It's called cardiovascular disease. What is that? We know that the average heart beats about 100,000 times every day. We know that our hearts pump about 6 quarts of blood through about 12,000 miles of arteries, vessels, and capillaries every 24 hours. Our heart is a very important part of our body. Would you agree? Okay, as an engineer, I can tell you this. When we create something, a space probe, for example, and send it to another planet where we cannot fix something on that probe if it goes wrong, the one piece that the whole mission depends on is called mission critical. And it's built to last, and if it fails, it's got backups, and if it fails, it's got backups. Our hearts are obviously very powerful, very important parts of our bodies. In engineering terms, our hearts are mission critical. Does it make any sense that they would suddenly stop after only 70 or 100 years? Something that's built so well and works so well and so efficiently. Does it make any sense to you that our hearts would suddenly stop after only 70 or 100 years? You know, the Essenes, the ancient Essenes, say that we've got 900-year bodies. 900 years. What would it be like to live 900 years? Think of all the things you could get done for 900 years. No? You wouldn't like that? Think of what it would mean when you say, honey, I love you for the rest of my life, and you get married. For the next 800 years. There's a whole workshop in there we could do. Why do our hearts... When I saw these statistics, it made no sense to me whatsoever. Here's what researchers are finding. Cardiovascular disease is a catch-all for these kinds of symptoms that result from long-term fear, frustration, anxiety, disappointment. This is what people like researchers Blumenthal from Duke University have found. These all fall under the category of what we call hurt. And what the researchers now are beginning to understand is that the reason that our hearts stop working after 70 to 100 years, it appears that 70 to 100 years is about the length of time that this magnificent organ in our bodies can function in the presence of unresolved hurt before the hurt steals from us the very things that we cherish the most, our own lives. Hurt. Is it possible that hurt kills us? And this is exactly what they're finding. Unresolved hurt. I'm not saying that hurt is a bad thing. It's a gauge. It tells us where we are in the world in our belief systems because our hurts are all based upon our beliefs. Unresolved hurt is what it is, they say, that takes our lives. Now, the Essenes, the ancient Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is fascinating to me, and you'll laugh when you hear this. They say the first 100 years are the toughest. But do you think about this? They are. Because it may be those first 100 years, that is where we go through the hurt of losing all of the things that we cherish and that we hold dear. All the things that have been familiar to us, the people, the places, the ways of life. And for many people, it appears that hurt is so deep that they simply don't survive. Or when someone close to them leaves the world, they simply say, I don't want to be in this world without this person or without my family or without my friends. They say, if you can get through those first 100, hang in there. If you can get through those first 100 years. Now, a dear friend, Norm Shealy's just come out with a new book. He's saying that we should be on this earth at least 140 years. What I'm going to say right now is Western science has found no good reason why our bodies should fail after 70 to 100 years. What we now know is that every organ in your body and my body can reproduce the cells that makes that organ, including our brains and our hearts that we used to believe couldn't do it. Every one of our organs can reproduce the cells and heal themselves. We all have stem cells. You've got stem cells in your body right now. And they're waiting for you to direct them to the places where they can rebuild and regenerate. And they're waiting for you to send them the code of your belief, of your joy, of love, so that that cell can find its place in your bone or your heart or your muscle tissue. They're already there. You don't have to have newborn infants or zygotes for those stem cells. They happen there. They happen here. We all have stem cells. This is news for some people, but for others it's not. It's all based on what we're believing. If we're going to rewrite that reality code, we've got to change our beliefs. We've got to change the way that we're programming this code. I have spent a tremendous amount of my life researching the beliefs of cultures other than our Western culture. Because as I mentioned earlier, 1700 years ago, the language that tells us precisely what I'm sharing with you now, it was edited right out of our text. We lost 42 books out of the Bible that would eventually become our Western canonized Christian Bible. And some of those books that were left behind were condensed. We essentially have the Reader's Digest condensed version. And a lot was lost in the translation. In our culture, it didn't happen in other cultures. My thinking was, in cultures that have been least disturbed, you moved. In cultures that have been least disturbed by Western civilization, that's where we might find the essence of how we apply these principles in our lives. I know you've all heard a lot about the monks. You hear about the monks in Tibet all the time, beautiful young monks. Well, it was in another part of this monastery that we had the opportunity to meet with these men. And they were guarding another room, and this room is what I want you to see. I asked about this room. I knew there was a mural here. I said, can we see this mural? And they said, no, it's not possible. And I said, please, can we see this room? And they said, we can't do it. There's a form of begging in Tibet when you really want something. It's not a pretty sight, but it's done in all sincerity. What you do is you bow your head. You don't even look at the person. You hold your thumbs up like this, and you say the words Gucci, Gucci, Gucci. So you go Gucci, 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 Gucci. And you get a room full of 40 people asking the monks, Gucci, 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 if we can do this. And he knows we're sincere. Because we've come halfway around the world, 17,000 feet above sea level. We may never be there again. And he said, okay. So they took us down to this room because it is very non-Tibetan-like. This is what's behind that wall. It almost looks like a Christian icon of Buddha. Let's do a little close-up. With a halo around Buddha. What's so powerful? This is part of a teaching that's on this whole wall. Look at who Buddha is talking to. He is teaching people of every color. There are black and brown and red and yellow and even some blue people. Which is interesting because of the blue people you see in the Hindu tradition on the walls in India, in the Hindu temples. All different walks of life, all traditions, but look at what these people have. Every one of them has a halo, has the pranic aura, just like Buddha. Can you all see that? And this is what our little monk said. He said, this is the teacher. He said, but the true teacher never holds back what he's teaching. He will share it, so you never need your teacher again. Your teacher turns you loose in the world. He said what he has to say, and you are now free to live that. You don't have to come back to a true teacher again and again and again. And he said, everyone that Buddha was teaching learned to do what Buddha did. And he said, here, I'll show you. And I said, so what is it that they were teaching? And what they're teaching is precisely what we're talking about now, how to communicate with this field through the power of feeling and emotion and belief. They're saying that belief and feeling, we believe something, we have a feeling about what we believe. That feeling is based in our hearts. Non-judgment, and this is just what the scientists now are finding out. Judgment and ego happen in our minds, in our brains, but this place of non-judgment happens right here in our heart. You're going to see another healing in just a moment that shows precisely how this happens. Non-judgment, it's heart-based. It's feeling the feelings from our hearts as if the healing has already happened, and doing it from a place that is not based in judgment. The ancient instructions for how to transcend our judgments are really clear. And it's beyond the scope of what I can do in here really, really well. In 90 minutes, I want you to know what's available. 1700 years ago, these are the instructions that were edited in the Council of Nicaea in the year 324 Common Era, 324 AD. We know that they're there because they're being recovered in scrolls and texts, just like this. This is part of the New Testament scroll that was actually found, preserved in a peat bog in Ireland, when the shovel of a backhoe driver turned it over and he found this very well preserved, the original book of Psalms. It was in the news this last summer that they found this. So, I've got a little book. It's called Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer in 5 chapters that describes how to transcend judgment and ego in this kind of creation. And I just want you to know that it's available. Just flip through it, take some notes. You don't even have to get the book. Just leave it in the bookstore. Just write down the good stuff. Part of one of the edits. Here's one of those edits. How many of you ever heard ask and you shall receive? You all heard that before? I've had people say, man, I ask and ask and ask, and I never receive. I've asked for a Camaro in the garage, a pile of gold in the living room, and nothing's ever happened. How come? Well, not that it's about gold in the Camaro, but this may give us some ideas of what's happening. What I'd like to do is share with you the original, as you and I are seeing it today, the original translation, and then we'll go back before the translations happened. So when we look today, you can either look at this in the King James Version of John 16:23-24, or if you have Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer, it's on page 166, 167. You don't have to write it down. The translation that we get today says, quote, whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name. This has nothing to do with religion, by the way. I'm just using the language as the teacher shared it. Whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, he'll give it to you. Hitherto have ye asked nothing in my name. So it's saying that we haven't even asked. Even if you think you asked, you haven't asked. The next piece of this simply says, ask and you shall receive, that your joy may be full. They cut out the good stuff. The juicy 2 sentences that tell us how to do this were edited right out of the text 1,700 years ago. Would you like to see what they are? I would too, and that was exactly why I put them in here. When I began to understand this, I said, why don't we put these things back in the texts so that we can have them? Let's go back and look. This is from the Aramaic, the original Aramaic. This translation comes from Neil Douglas Clotes. There are other translators who have done very similar languages. It's very similar. And here's what it says. Quote, all things that you ask straightly, directly from inside my name, you'll be given. So far, you've not done this. So right here, it looks quite a bit like the first translations. We still haven't asked, is what it's saying. Here's the next piece. Look at this. It says, quote, ask without hidden motive and be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire, that your gladness be full. That's the piece that was missing. What are they saying? What is the piece without hidden motive? That's where we go, where we have no ego and no judgment, no attachment to the rightness or the wrongness or the outcome. Ask without hidden motive. Don't ask for it to be present. Come from the place that's already there. Be is not asking. Be means it's already here. Be surrounded by the things that you're choosing. Be surrounded by your joy. Be surrounded by your healing, by the peace that's already there. Feel the feelings as if those things have already happened. Be enveloped by what you desire. Now what physicists are telling us is this is the quality of belief that speaks to that field of energy, to the divine matrix. You got to give it something to work with. If it's going to mirror back to you what you've created in your heart, you've got to give it something to mirror back. Where did we learn to feel only the things that we fear and what we don't have? Where did we learn to feel the horror of looking at the checkbook at the end of the month and seeing no mortgage money there, rather than feeling the abundance of what we know is true in our lives? Where did we learn to do that? Where did we learn to stop trusting the wisdom of our bodies to heal and become so frightened that we think we've got to run to someone else? Remember years ago, you never used to see commercials for drugs on TV? Now it's hard not to. And some of the drugs, I still don't know what they do. They have the commercials. I don't really know what they do, but I know the side effects can be really bad. I think, why in the world would I want this, whatever this thing is? Because, nosebleeds, diarrhea, vomiting, other than that. Yeah, ask your doctor. This is the piece that was lost out of that text. And if that sounds too religious, the teacher and philosopher Neville, early in the century, said precisely the same thing. He said, you must make your future dream a present fact by assuming the feeling of your wish fulfilled, assuming the feeling as if the outcome has already happened. When you ask for something to happen, what have you just implied? Honestly, have you ever thought about this? Even well-intentioned, when you say, dear God, please let there be healing in the bodies of my loved ones, or let there be peace in the world, you may actually be supporting the very thing you'd like to change. Because when you say, please let it be here, you're telling the field, you're telling that divine matrix or God, however, whatever language you like, you're telling that it's not there now, and that's what's being mirrored back to us. What happens when hundreds of thousands of people get together and pray for peace? What do you think happens? I don't know. We've done it a number of times, and we see what's happening in the world now. It might be interesting to get hundreds of thousands of people together and feel the feeling as if peace is already there. It was done during the Lebanese-Israeli war in the early 1980s. Researchers went over, were trained to feel the feeling of peace in their hearts. They were positioned throughout the war-torn areas in Lebanon and Israel. And during the windows of time when they were feeling peace, all that happened was peace. Not one terrorist activity, no suicide bombings were happening in the early 1980s. Emergency hospital room visits declined. Traffic accidents declined. Crimes against people declined while they were feeling peace. They weren't trying to make the war stop. They weren't trying to impose their will upon the world outside them. They were simply feeling that peace in their hearts. This became known as the Maharishi effect. If you've ever studied this, or you can Google it and find out. We know this works. People say, why aren't more people doing it? I think there's so much fear in the world right now, people have lost faith and confidence that we can really do much to make a difference in what's happening in the world. The key is to feel from the outcome as if it's already happened without attachment to the outcome. Now there's a whole workshop right here. Feeling as if the healing has already happened without attachment to the healing. That's hard to do sometimes. If you're standing in an emergency room ICU next to your loved one on a gurney, listening to a little heart machine tick away their heartbeats, and you think you're going to lose them in 20 minutes, you've got an attachment to the outcome. You don't want to lose your loved one. I've been in that situation. I'm not saying this is easy to do. I'm saying this is what quantum physicists are finding with regard to how we work in the field, rewriting our reality code. And this is precisely the instructions the ancients left. They said maybe this is what they mean when they say turn it over to God. We've got to let go of our attachment to the outcome. We can still participate without the attachment to precisely what that outcome is all about. Reality is a code. To rewrite the reality code, we've got to change our beliefs. So how much power do we have to change our world? If there's a field of energy out there and everything comes from that field, and we are able to select and choose what comes from that field and what materializes in our world through the power of our belief, you tell me, how much power do we have to change our world, to change our bodies? I'm going to tell you right now, you have all the power you need to create all the change that you choose. Don't buy in to what you're being shown in the mass media. We don't have to have a big war. We do not have to live in a fear-based world unless we choose to do so. And you are a part of that change that's happening right now. That's why conferences like this are so important. Because it seems that we do better with these kinds of changes when we're supported by others who believe as we do. The question is, now that modern science is recognizing that we are directly influencing what happens in our world, scientists are saying, okay, yeah, the influence is there, but what do we do with it? How do we use it? How do we apply it in our lives? And this is so interesting to me because I was trained in the language of science, and I come from the world of science. Science is good. It is a language that describes our universe and our bodies and how we work. Science is good. It's simply a language that describes how the universe works and how we work. But it's a relatively recent language. Science is only about 300 years old. And as good as it is, the best scientists will admit that there are glaring gaps and inconsistencies in what we know in the language of science, on the one hand. On the other hand, there are other languages that have always described the way our universe works in our bodies. They're not scientific, but they've been around a lot longer. Some of them have been around 6, 7, 8,000 years in the case of the Hindu Vedas. So as a scientist working behind the scenes during the Cold War, a very frightening time in the history of our world, my question was this, was if science and ancient spirituality are the two great ways of knowing in our world, and neither one of them alone can solve the problems, what happens if we marry them together? Doesn't that make sense to you? It makes tremendous sense. What if we marry the wisdom of a 5, 6, 7,000-year-old tradition with the best science of today into a greater wisdom? Will that help us to find the language to address the challenges of our time today? That was my feeling. My conditioning, however, was that science and spirituality are mutually incompatible. You have to choose one path or the other. I'm going to tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. And where the greatest advances are being made in understanding how the universe works today and how your body works and how your relationships work is when we cross those traditional boundaries between science and spirituality. Honoring both, but crossing the boundary that keeps them separate and marrying them into a greater wisdom, because that's the way we work. Every atom in your body, right this minute, and the minute that just passed, and that minute that just passed, every atom in your body in this very instant is emerging anew from this field, as long as your agreement in consciousness will allow that to happen. When you dishonor your agreement in consciousness, then the new cannot re-emerge and you begin to deteriorate. If we're going to use this field, we've got to understand how it works. We've got to speak the language it recognizes. And this leads us to what is called the great spiritual mystery. As different as one appears from another, almost universally, the ancient spiritual traditions tell us that there's something that you and I do in our lives that triggers a process inside of our bodies. And when that process begins, it interacts with the forces of creation and affects our physical world. Something that we do in our lives affects our physical world. And you're going to see some examples of that before we leave here today. If you do not understand how this happens, when it does, we call it a miracle. But if you do understand it, it's no longer a miracle, it becomes a technology. If you can create an experience of your body over and over and over again, on demand, consistently, repeatedly, if you can do something in here and create an effect that touches your world out there, man, that's a technology. And to me, that's a very... Okay, we've piloted this program with young people in secondary schools. And I use different languages, different slides. We have a screen. We use butcher paper from the floor to the ceiling, so the whole wall is the screen, and all the images look very real. And when I shared this with them, my language, I said, isn't that cool? I don't have any kids in my life. Cool is not the word that's being used today. So they educated me. They said, well, this is really sweet. So, isn't this really sweet? It's a technology. And I cannot think of a more powerful technology. This rivals anything we could ever build in a machine outside of our bodies. I've worked in the high-tech industry, and I've seen some very sweet technology, but nothing that rivals what we're doing right here. Well, the scientific experiments now are showing precisely the same thing. We looked at some yesterday. It's in the book. I won't do them again today. But what they're saying is that heart-based feeling and emotion changes the DNA inside of our bodies, producing quantum effects that change our physical world. We've said the same thing. And when we do this, we are all participating. We're participating in what happens in our world and our lives. And it's all based on what we believe about our world. So the new discoveries are telling us the power to change our bodies and our world is actually based on something that sounds very non-scientific. It's based on what we call feeling and belief. The feeling and the belief of what is real. So I thought that would be a good place to define feeling and belief. Everybody's talking about it. I sat in on a program yesterday, and then I've heard some other speakers use the terms feeling and belief, but no one's really defined it. And I think it's useful to do that because it means different things to different people. So let's look at an old Sanskrit drawing. This is a page right out of an ancient Sanskrit text. You're all familiar with the energy centers, the chakras, that are linked to the endocrine glands in your bodies. So the mineral content of the endocrine gland, the crystalline mineral content, is what's linked to these chakras. What the ancient traditions, in this case the Sanskrit traditions, are telling us is there are 7 of these energy systems. The upper 3, the communication and the imaging centers, are, they say, what are considered to be or associated with what we call thought. So when we think about something, we're using these upper energy centers. What they say, however, is that the lower three energy centers are where emotion comes from, and they say that you and I are capable of only two primary emotions, and that's all. And Mom and I have this conversation with Mom all the time about the difference between feeling and emotion. Mom says, I always thought feeling and emotion were pretty much the same thing. And I did too. I was raised in a very conservative community in the Midwest, and we use them almost interchangeably. But the ancients make a distinction, and it's a powerful distinction. They say that we're capable of only two primary emotions, love and whatever you believe, whatever you think the opposite of love is. Maybe it's love and fear. And when I know this is on the recording now, so I have to be really clear. It'll be out here for 20 years. When you get right down to the deepest teachings, love and fear are two aspects of the same thing. They're very, very closely related, even though they're polarities. They're polarities of the same experience. So what the ancients are saying, in this case the Sanskrit text, they're saying that emotion comes from these lower energy centers, and there are only two primary emotions, love or fear. So we think about something in that field of all possibilities. We capture it in our minds. We visualize it. What it is that we'd like to have, our perfect relationship, perfect health, peace in our world, abundance in the checkbook, whatever it is. And the piece that was left out in many of the teachings, and this is what they're saying, is into that thought we pump, we fuel from these lower creative centers. So into that thought we pump our love for what we're thinking, or sometimes subconsciously, our fear for what we're thinking. And when we do, what is the one energy center that's not accounted for? Exactly. It's our heart. And when we do, we create what we call a feeling that is linked with the heart. This is where feeling occurs. Heart-based feeling. Feelings don't happen in your mind. They don't happen in, well, they do happen in the lower centers, but that's a different workshop. It's a whole different program. Okay. When we think about something, and into that something, we fuel it with our love or our fear for that something, we create what we call a feeling. And now we have just defined feeling. It's the union of thought and emotion. Sometimes the emotions that we pump into our feelings are conscious. Sometimes they're unconscious. We do entire programs about how to deal with that. That's not where we are here today. What I'd like for you to see from this is that feeling is based in your heart. And that's going to be really important in just a couple of minutes. Feeling and beliefs are very closely linked. When you believe something, you have a strong feeling about that something, one way or another. Would you agree? Yeah, we usually do. Feelings and beliefs are closely related. So when we have experiences of hate, sadness, joy, compassion, those are not emotions, they're feelings. If we're hating, we're generally thinking about something, and into that thought, we're having a fear. We may not always be conscious of what it is, or our sadness or our joy. These are feelings and beliefs. They're not emotions. Are you okay on that? For some people, it's review. For some people, you've never seen it before. It's going to be important for where we go. Does it make sense? You okay with that? All right. Feeling and belief, the reason that they are so powerful in our lives is because they are a code, literally a code. Feeling and belief is a code that translates those invisible waves of possibility into the stuff our world, our universe, our bodies are made of. Belief literally takes the invisible waves of possibility, collapses, condenses those waves into the particles that become the reality of our world. Does that make sense? If it does, then what it tells you, if it does make sense, it tells you that we are only limited by what we are willing to allow ourselves to believe. What I've learned in our intensive workshops is many people in our part of the world are not even aware of the difference between when they're thinking and when they're feeling. And if I ask them, I invite them to create a feeling, they're trying to do it with their mind. However, if we go into a Tibetan monastery, monks and nuns, they live in their hearts. And they have to work to create a thought. It's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing. Does this make sense to you, why this is important? Your heart is much more powerful in terms of electrical and magnetic fields, the stuff our world is made of. Feelings and beliefs produce these heart waves of energy, but they're not limited to our hearts. Look at where they go. They go beyond our bodies. From a quantum perspective, you don't end where your skin or your jacket or your hair is in that chair. From a quantum perspective, if I were looking at you through my quantum lens, oh, there you are. You're just a big sea of energy, all melding together in a really beautiful way. Because that's the way we work. And that's what allows us to touch our world in ways now that we're only beginning to understand. Those heart waves change the cells of our bodies, and that's very well documented in the open literature. What is a little challenging for researchers right now is that those heart waves are changing the atoms of our physical world. They know it happens. So I'm going to acknowledge this. Scientists know that you and I can affect the physical world beyond our bodies through what we're creating inside of our hearts. The question is, to what degree? And that is where the controversy is right now. To what degree are we capable of influencing our physical world? If you read the research papers, there's a lot of controversy. This is where the action is right now. How many are familiar with the author Neville? Anyone have the opportunity to see him when... Well, we got about 7 hands, and that's a lot for an audience this size. He was a brilliant philosopher. He died in 1974. He's from the Indies, and he wrote under the name of Neville. And if you're not familiar with his work, I'm going to invite you to look into it. He wrote a powerful little book. One is called The Power of Awareness. One is called The Law and the Promise. And there's some other ones out there. Each chapter is about a page long, and you read that page and you think about it for a week. It's one of those kinds of books. The Power of Awareness and The Law and the Promise. 1952, Neville was asked why he was writing the books that he was writing. And his response to that question is the reason that we're in here today. Look at what Neville wrote. Neville said he wrote to reveal, this is a quote, our infinite power against which no earthly force is of the slightest significance. Do you believe that it's possible within your body? Do you have a power within you in the chair right now against which no earthly force is of the slightest significance? Do you believe that that's possible? Do you believe you have that? Do you use it? Why not? Because you and I have been conditioned to believe that that power doesn't exist. There's a part of us, there's a part of our ancient memory that clings to that possibility. We want to believe it. And that's why we're so powerfully drawn to the kinds of movies like The Matrix and the old movies back in the Middle Ages where miracles are happening all the time. People are out slaying dragons and falling in love in really cool places and all that. Because we want to believe that those miracles are still possible. But we're conditioned. And that conditioning probably runs deeper than even you and I can even acknowledge. Deeper than I can acknowledge right now. I was raised in a relatively conservative community in northern Missouri. The show me state. And I was told over and over and over again that in this world we're little more than insignificant specks of dust. And that's about it. And that things just happen. You can be walking down the street living a good life and all of a sudden some disease drops out of nowhere and you're gone in 3 weeks. And that was my conditioning. And even though my mind knows that is not the case, there's a part of me subconsciously that heard that so many times. But to some degree, even I still accept that a little bit. But I want to share with you a little bit. Belief. Belief may be the single most powerful force in the universe. If you are capable of imagining anything in your mind and then breathing life into that possibility and feeling it. And when you do that, you're changing the electrical and the magnetic field in your heart and touching the atoms of your physical world to make that happen. Wow, what could be more powerful than that? What could be more powerful than that? What challenge could we not meet? What disease could we not transcend? What war could we not heal? When the general population really, really gets what you and everyone in this conference and myself, what's happening here this weekend, everything changes. It must. When we really get our power. And the beauty is not everyone has to believe or understand the same thing to benefit. And they probably won't. A relatively few number of people will grasp the power and the significance of this language. And it's kind of like the stock market. When a few of the blue chips do well, the whole market can benefit. I don't know where that analogy came from, but It's kind of like, I haven't watched the market for the last couple of days. Belief, the most powerful force in the universe. I want to share with you an example. This is some of the things, I've never shared this in public before. This is from a trip, 1998, a 22-day pilgrimage into the highlands of central China and Tibet. And you've seen some of the images, but this particular portion I've never shared before because it's an ancient example of just how powerful belief really is. This is, we were up above 16,000 feet above sea level. Nothing grows there. It's just you and the earth and the sky and the water and God. Have you ever noticed how whenever prophets and holy people, when they have a revelation, where does it usually come from? Usually someplace up high where there's no diversions, there's no distractions, there's nothing else there, nothing else to do. You might as well, receive a message from God because there's nothing to eat, there's no fish in the water. I mean, nothing's happening. So we were on this road right here, and it was in the spring. They'd had big snows that year. We thought the roads were clear, and they were for most of the trip until we found this. This is a snow slide that is now crossed. Here's our road right here. This is a snow slide that has come across the road. It's an avalanche. Someone has been able to tunnel through to let some traffic past, but we are in a bus that was brought up from the mainland, and this is our translator. No photographs, please, of any of these. This is our translator. He's sizing up the front of the bus to see if it's going to fit through this tunnel. It's not, and this is where the trip became a real adventure. We never saw that bus again. We left our bus, walked through our little avalanche, and picked up the only mode of transportation that we could find on the other side. We were all on a cattle truck. To go down, but that was fun, to go down to this mountainside and the entrance to this cave where a miracle happened about 800 years ago. How many are familiar with the great Tibetan yogi Milarepa? Anyone in here study? Some of you have never heard Milarepa. Some are very familiar with. I'll just tell you the brief story of Milarepa. And the reason that I'm aware of this, my very first yoga teacher 35 years ago was a Sikh. And we would begin our yoga sessions, and he would share stories of Milarepa's life. Milarepa, 800 years ago, was a powerful yogi and mystic in his own right. And he came from a wealthy family, very similar to the story of Buddha. He came from a wealthy family, and so he had all the material wealth, and he also had his psychic abilities. A neighboring village invaded his village and killed his entire family, and he was so enraged that he used his psychic powers to kill at least 35 other people. And when he had done that, he realized that it was a misuse of his power. And from that moment on, his life changed. He left all of his material possessions, all of his wealth behind. He went into a series of caves, and this is one of them. And he never left again. And he stayed through the end of his life to deepen his inner abilities and to honor the gift of life, hoping in some way to compensate for the misuse of his power. The few people that did find him, he had some clothing when he went to this cave. He learned the inner power of psychic heat, so he never had to have clothing for warmth, and his clothing became tattered and shredded. The only thing he ate were the nettles that grow at this elevation around this cave that are rich in chlorophyll. And his hair and his body turned a vibrant green that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And they said if you happened to come up on Milarepa in his cave, it was a frightening sight because his hair was down to his waist, it was green, his body was green, his teeth were kind of yellow-green. He didn't have a lot of clothes on, so it was a pretty scary thing to see. But there were some students that did go and study with him. And one of the things that he was trying to share with them is the power of their belief and that they are not bound by the physicality of this world. And one of the ways that he went about doing that, he lived in the cave. And one of his students said, "Don't you feel confined in this cave?" And I've got a new book coming out in April, and I tell the story in more detail. But briefly, what he said to his student here, he said, this cave provides me shelter. He says, but it doesn't confine me. Here, I'll show you. And he walked over to the wall of the cave, and he put his hand up against the cave. He pushed on that solid wall, the native earth. And to his student, he felt that wall was a boundary, and then Milarepa kept pushing, and his hand went right into that rock. And it happened in a number of places. And I walked over to this place and I put my hand, it's about 16 inches deep, that he went into the cave wall. And I thought, well, maybe somebody hoaxed it. And when I put my hand in there, it fits so perfectly in that place. I felt in that moment that it couldn't have been hoaxed. And then there are other places in this cave where he did the same with his feet. And the whole point of this is that in his mind, in his belief, the wall was not a boundary. And he embodied that and shared that with his student. When his student saw that happen, his student had to do one of two things. He either had to rearrange his belief system to accommodate what he'd just seen, or he had to walk out of the cave and say, I'm never coming back here again. And this is one of the ways we change our beliefs. We change our beliefs either by being shown the logical reason why something is true or it's not true, and that goes through our mind, logic. Or we're shown a miracle that bypasses our mind and goes right to our heart, and we've seen it with our own eyes, and it forever changes the way we see our world. And hopefully we're going to do both in here today. I apologize, but I thought the image would come out better than that. The question, is that a miracle or is it a technology? Is it a miracle or a technology, the fact that Milarepa was able to put his hand into that wall the way that he did? Is the universe that we're living in a simulation that has been created for us to have an experience here that we cannot have anywhere else? Sounds like a movie, doesn't it? Where do you think that movie came from? Is the universe really a very ancient virtual reality? Now, we're not talking about who or what or why. I mean, all kinds of questions come up. The question they're asking, is it possible that you and I could be living in a world that's not so real? Let me ask, what have the Aboriginal traditions said to us for about 20,000 years? What do they say about this world? Is this the real world? No, they say it's a dream world. Where's the real world? Somewhere else, right? Christian traditions, what do they say about this world? We're here for a while, but where's the real cool, sweet place to be? Where is it? Hereafter heaven, somewhere else. Native American traditions say the same thing. So this idea is not so bizarre from the perspective of many ancient traditions. Are we living a simulation? Okay, well, my man brain, when I began to see how seriously scientists are taking this, I wanted to see. I mean, I kind of know what a simulation is, but I looked it up. I wanted to see what a simulation is for. Look at this. A simulation. What is the purpose of a simulation? It's to master something that is not known in a safe environment so that you understand how to use that before you get to the place where you really need it. Is it possible that you and I are living a reality here, learning about something, and we'll talk about what that something is. Are we learning something here in a relatively safe environment, given a period of time to do it, because we're going to need it somewhere else? Do you think that's a possibility? How does that feel to you? I mean, it's a bizarre concept, but how does it feel? Does it feel like maybe, where have your spiritual and religious traditions said you're going to go when you finish here? Someplace else, right? And when you go there, the rules may be a little bit different. I began to ask the question, if we're here mastering an unknown, maybe how to use the language of the heart to create in a reality. Can you imagine what would happen if every thought, feeling, and emotion you had in every instant became manifest immediately? Wouldn't that be a pretty interesting world? I was reading some statistics. Do you know that for the average male, the average male in Western society has around 1,200 thoughts a day average, and if they're creative, it can go up to 20,000 thoughts a day. About 90% of those are sexual in nature. Can you imagine what would happen if they manifested immediately every time we had one of those? It'd be a pretty wild world. But even if it's not sexual in nature, can you imagine if every passing thought that you had became a reality, how confusing your life and your world would be? Is it possible that we're here learning about the power of thought, feeling, and emotion, isolating the possibilities, choosing what we would like to experience, and learning to breathe life into that, to manifest it in a physical reality, and learn it really well here because we're going to need it when we get someplace else? Do you think that's possible? Maybe. Well, I began to ask the question, if it's true, who would make such a simulation? And the next question is, who would benefit from it? Who would benefit from that? You answer me. Who would benefit? Is it possible that you and I have created the simulation so that we can learn something here that we're going to need somewhere else? You know that you're not even in this room, right? You know that there's a part of you that's somewhere else. You communicate with it all the time, whether you call it a higher self or an over-self or whatever it is. There's a part of you that's outside of this simulation somewhere, whatever it is. How does this concept feel to you? Is it a bizarre concept? Does it make sense? Okay, let's take a little further. This is a quote from 2006 Templeton Award laureate John Barrow from Oxford University. Quote, he says, it's long been recognized that technological civilizations only a little bit more advanced than ours will have the capacity to simulate entire universes in which entities can emerge and communicate with one another. He's asking the question, has it already happened? Has civilization already advanced to the point where this is happening and we are living in the result of that? Does it sound like we just took a big step out there somewhere? Well, signs of a virtual reality. How would you know? Would you even know if you were in a simulation? Would you know it? I mean, the whole idea, if you step into a flight simulator, the whole idea is it's so real, you feel like you're in the cockpit of a plane, right? Or I worked for Martin Marietta. We put probes on Mars. We built simulations for the Martian surface. In there, it's supposed to be like the real thing. If you didn't know, okay, let's just do it this way. How many Star Trek fans in here? Do you remember the episode? I didn't think I was going to do this, but I will. Do you remember the episode where, and I think this is Second Generation. What is the prime directive of Star Trek Second Generation? They're exploring the universe where nobody's ever been. However, what? They cannot interfere with any of those realities. You remember? Do you remember that? Okay, so they're out checking out a new universe like they always do every week. They find a solar system that's kind of like ours. It's got a sun that's kind of like ours. Lo and behold, there's a planet that's kind of like ours. But that planet never became technological. They were happy agricultural people, very cool, very healthy, very sweet. They had good families. Everything was cool. They had no way of knowing that in about 24 hours, their sun was going to explode into a supernova and microwave everything in the solar system. Okay, so the Enterprise is in a quandary here. Because those are humans, they want to save their lives, but they can't interfere. But not to worry, they come up with a very cool solution. Here's what they do. When everyone on the planet... You want to hear the story? Okay. When everyone on the planet goes to sleep, what they do is they beam everyone on the planet onto the holodeck of the Starship Enterprise, which has been made to look exactly like their planet. So when they wake up, they think they're still on their planet. They don't know that they're now hurtling through space a bajillion miles an hour on a starship. And the whole idea is the starship is going to take them to another place where there's another Earth-like planet that looks so much like theirs. When they go back to sleep, they're going to beam them down. They'll wake up in a safe planet. No one will ever know the difference. Because if all of a sudden the crew just materialized in front of them and they didn't have technology, they would make them into gods. They'd worship them, right? Has that ever happened around here before, do you think? Okay, it's a very, very good episode, and everything is going well. They beam the entire inhabitant population of the planet onto the Starship Enterprise. They're in the holodeck. It looks just like their planet. They wake up in the morning as if they'd had a dream, and they're walking around. Everything looks good. But you know, something always has to go wrong in these programs, right? Okay, the Starship has a power failure, and they can't hold the hologram in place any longer. And all of a sudden it starts to break down. And the people that were in the forest and in the rocks and the trees and the canyons, all of a sudden that hologram dissolves and disappears. And they're looking at fluorescent lights in the Starship Enterprise. And they're looking at all the people behind the scenes in one-piece tight leotards. These guys had never seen before, wondering where everybody came from. And then the whole episode becomes an episode of human sensitivity and honoring. And it's a very powerful, I get emotional when I see it. But I can't help but think maybe something real similar might be going on here. I believe that the world we're in, it's as real as we make it. What our science is showing us is that reality is malleable. It's soft. We can change it. and we change it through something that we are choosing to do inside of our bodies. So whether you're talking about the abundance in your checkbook or the healing of your body or the peace between nations or where we go in 2012 or what happens on 2013, all of that is up for grabs because you and I are choosing it right now, and we're waking up to the fact that we have the power to make those choices. Signs of virtual reality. How would you know? Here's what a virtual reality looks like. I went to a couple of different sites. Virtual realities have a beginning and an end. They start somewhere and they end somewhere. The users have a point where they begin and where they end. There are rules in a virtual reality, in a simulation, and the idea is that as you use them more and more, you get better and better at what you're doing. Like maybe relationships, like maybe feelings and emotions. In a virtual reality, the user is communicating with some form of themselves outside of the virtual reality. And there are choice points within the reality where they can change everything. Now this is how a virtual reality is defined. Does it sound familiar? Except for the context, it sounds a lot like what our most cherished and ancient spiritual traditions have always said, in a different language. There's a place where our universe began, whether we call it the Big Bang or in the beginning, somebody created it. It's got an end point, whether you call it the end of days or the last of days or whatever you want. It doesn't mean the world ends, it means the simulation ends. Users have a place where they come in and we leave. We're born and we die, or other things can happen. There are rules, and we call them the rules of physics as we're learning them, how we interact with our reality. We're supposed to get better at this stuff as we go along. We're communicating with something outside of our reality, whether we call it God or a higher self or angels or oversouls or whatever language you want to use. And there are choice points where we can jump from one possibility to another, except for the context. Doesn't it sound a lot like what we've been told for 5,000 years anyway? Maybe we are in a simulation, in a virtual reality. Nick Bostrom from Department of Philosophy, Oxford University, wrote a paper. There's no question what this paper's about. Look at the title. Are you living in a computer simulation? I'm going to save you the whole paper. He goes through some very complex mathematics. He uses those mathematics to come up with three possibilities. Only one of those three applies to what we're doing right here. And here's that third possibility. Number 3, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. The odds are greater that we are in a virtual reality than we're not, based on the mathematics of these papers. I'm going to invite you to check this out. Look at this. This is a quote. Seth Lloyd, MIT professor of programming, MIT professor, he was author of a book came out last year, Programming the Universe. He says that, quote, the history of the universe is, in effect, a huge and ongoing quantum computation. The universe is a quantum computer. He doesn't say it acts like or it's kind of like. He says it is a quantum computer. All right, if our universe is a virtual reality based in consciousness, in belief, how does it work? Let's go with this just for a minute, and then we're going to come back and do something with it. How does it work? Beliefs are binary. Would you agree with me that we either do or don't believe? You have a belief, it's either yes or no, right? Or it's off or on. When we believe, yes or no, off or on, we're having a feeling in our heart, electrical and magnetic fields that are changing the stuff our world is made of, right? Beliefs are binary. We either believe and create atoms, or we don't believe and there's no atom. Beliefs, binary. Yes, no, here, not there, atom. No atom. The physical universe, from this perspective, is nothing more and nothing less than the beliefs that are on. And you're going to see an example in just a minute of how quickly you can turn a belief off and the atoms will disappear in response to that. The patterns of what we believe, those fields become the atoms of nature. We don't know if this is true or not. This is being seriously considered by people that you would be amazed to know are considering this. There's a whole workshop in there. The question, are we living a virtual reality? Is it a fact or is it a metaphor? Doesn't make any difference. And here's why. Either way, if it is truly what's happening, if it's not, it's a really good way to start the conversation. If it's a fact or it's a metaphor, here's why I'm even sharing it with you today. If you know the code, either way, fact or metaphor, if you know the code, you choose your own limits. And that's why I'm sharing it with you today. If you know the code of how this physical universe works, then you choose the limits of what's possible and what's not for you in your life. And it's not fairy tale and it's not make-believe, although there are fairy tales about this. It changes everything.